My goal today is not really to tell you much about Ephraim Shay, because this town probably knows more about him than most towns anywhere would. But my goal is to explain to you that while you folks understandably know about Ephraim Shay as a benefactor of the town, an inventor, he did the water district, he had the Hemlock Central, etc. Well, that's why you people know him. My goal is to explain to you why he is world known across the entire world. And it's because of his invention of that locomotive. This happens to be the one that I've run for 30 years in Oregon. But it was this locomotive that changed the timber industry, the logging industry in this country forever. I want to take you back when Ephraim Shay first started working in the lumber industry in the late 1870s. He was faced with the same problem that every lumberman who had timber had, okay? I have got timber, I've got a mill, but I've got to cut the timber, and then I've got a log that I've got to somehow get from that stump to my mill. And you have to understand, 1870s, 1880s, you don't have cars, you don't have trucks, you don't have anything. But what you do have in 1869 is, thanks to Abraham Lincoln, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And that was a boom to the lumber industry because now there's towns springing up in the next few years along that railroad out into the west, tapping new resources. And so now there was a big demand for lumber, but it was still pretty much mom and pop operations of how do we get the log from our timber, once we cut it, into the mill. And this is in the Pacific Northwest, which was just now coming online because of the Transcontinental Railroad. Here the timber is huge, and the hills are steep, and the mountains are great, but the resources are unbelievable. But you can't get it to the mill economically, so it's not going to pay off. And so the early lumbermen from the 1870s all the way through until the late 1880s when Shay got involved, they were left with basically horses and oxen through whatever roads they could do. In the winter, it's actually an advantage in areas like this. You could actually, the ground froze and you could do carry this many logs maybe and skid it across. But this is crude. This is not going to bring a lot of logs to any mill. Your mill's not going to thrive. It's not going to build a town around it. It's going to supply maybe that town for lumber, etc. But this is not how you get the job done. And if you were lucky, you had a river next to your timber holdings, you might be able to get the logs down the river and have log drives, etc. You lost a lot of them along the way because it would break through the log dams and you lose them, and your competitor downstream would take the logs. So this is a crude way to do it. This is literally how the lumber industry was fighting with how do we get from the stump to the mill in a fashion that's not killing me. And here comes Ephraim Shay. He had his timberlands, and he started to study that his logging portion of his operation, just the logging, was 73% of the cost was to get the cut tree log to the mill. And he found that just to be unacceptable. There's got to be a better way. And so he said, well, you know, railroads are coming on now that we have the Transcontinental, and this is the type of locomotive that was being built. They would go across the plains and they would go across the valleys, etc. He said, well, you know, if I could do a locomotive operation, I could bring a lot more volume. I could do it year round, but that kind of locomotive isn't going to run on the kind of track that the loggers are building. The loggers are laying down track into a gully or a valley, logging that out, picking up the track and going someplace else. And so if you try to run that locomotive on this kind of track, that's what's going to happen. And so this is what the lumbermen that were experimenting with using any kind of locomotive that was available at the time was faced with. These rails, they're not built for like going across the prairies. We need something that's going to be able to carry logs effectively, go up grades that the rod type engines won't do. And this is when Shay came up after some innovation and anxiety, several drafts. This is one of his first patents. He decided, okay, the rigid wheelbase of a rod type engine will not take the twisty, curvy logging type track that the loggers like me, Shay, are going to do. So I need something that has wheels in the front and the back that are on trucks that pivot like on a boxcar, pivot in and out, that can follow the track through its curves and little, with a short wheelbase. And the direct drive rod engines, they're too slippery because the minute you hit about a 2.5% slope, they spin and they stop. They're not gonna pull anything. So he said the innovation that made this so successful was, I'm gonna do a gear drive. I'm gonna give up on speed, because I don't need speed anyway, quite frankly, but I need to have some ability to go up steep grades and down steep grades over twisty track, and that's where the gear drive system that he developed came in. What he has is the cylinder drives the crank, which then goes forwards and backwards through line shafts and slip joints to the wheels, and on the outside of the wheels, like you see on the Shay outside, has a bevel gear. And it turns, depending if you throw your valves forward or backward for motion, it spins in one direction or the other, but the bevel gears turn the wheels in a geared fashion, and so they won't slip, they won't spin, they won't slip, and they'll just keep climbing. And so he went out, got himself a patent, which was very brilliant at the time, because there were other people experimenting with type of logging engines, but he came up with something that he realized was a game changer, that this geared system, and this is him in one of his very early engines that he had here in Michigan. This opened up he did it selfishly for himself. I need to get to my timber. I got timber that's gonna be much more valuable if I can cut the logging costs down. And I can cut the logging cost if the transportation cost, and this cut the transportation cost by about 5 times. It was that innovative. And so he started building a couple of these engines for other people, because other lumbermen said, hey, I could use one of those, I can now get into my timber, etc. So he started early construction and early design, had a couple of machine works companies starting to build different versions, and now this one's a 2-cylinder one here, it's a little larger. Same bevel gear and crank idea. See, these are the bevel gears on each axle. So the entire, if you think about it, the entire weight of the locomotive is bearing down on a drive wheel. Unlike that tender engine you saw, the big rod engine, the big one, that's just towing a car of water and oil or a fuel that is dead weight. Every ounce of weight, including the water and the fuel in a Shay, is bearing down on the track, so it increases the tractive effort. It makes the thing, it's like a billy goat, it'll climb up the side of a mountain. And so in here, you don't look at the track. You don't even have ties. Here they're actually building logs and putting strapped rail on top. And this is a Shay. This is what a Shay could do. They could take that kind of really god-awful, crude track and continue to operate. And this, you can pick this up and drop it down however you want it. And now look at the size of the logs that he's being able to pull. You don't have to worry about running over your horses and oxen that can't keep up with the log when it's going down grade. Now you've got a locomotive. And so he started with, and here's a Shay going through the water. He doesn't even need to build a bridge. Just lay the track through the creek. This is West Virginia, okay? And this picture was taken in the 1950s, okay? That was how versatile these Shays could be. They could just go through any place. And here, don't bother with a bridge, just put it through the creek. And you're pulling log loads, okay? So here's one of his early engines, and look what the capacity is of what you can get to your mill. And look at how much more lumber your mill can cut in a daily basis. Your mill's gonna get larger, the town around the mill is gonna get larger, and this is what changed the logging industry in this country, because of this simple geared idea, which he evolved over time, but all of a sudden it was becoming extremely popular. And this is a early builder's plate that I've got in my collection from one of his engines that he actually built here in Michigan, because he built a handful, was able to sell them, he could tell that he had something. And so he did advertisements for him, the Shay improved engine, locomotive engine. Well, he needed something bigger than just one or two machine shops. So what he did is, he was from Ohio, as you probably know. He went back to Ohio, to Lima, Ohio, where he knew some men that operated what was called the Lima Machine Works. And it had been around for quite a while, and they were machine works that did a lot of farm tractors and all sorts of other farm implements and other implements. It was just the Lima Machine Works. And he went and sold them his patent for this geared engine. And they sold it to him, they gave him 10 shares of stock in that, and he became a shareholder. And this is the actual original incorporation papers of the Lima, now Locomotive and Machine Company. And that's his signature on it. So now he's joined forces with machine work who's now going to start producing his patented locomotive and selling them. And so they started advertising these engines and started selling more of them and more of them. And they got more patents for other improvements as they went on. This is a patent plate they would put on the locomotives. And then they started selling them widely. They would spruce up an engine like that and send them to world fairs, expositions, and put them on display where lumbermen in the area where the exposition on would come and see the advantages of, okay, all of a sudden that timber that is, worth something only if you can access it, now is worth a fortune because you can get to it. And they were selling these things rapidly. And this is the plant, early plant, where they were making them in Lima, Ohio. And this was the only locomotive at the time that Lima was building. Everything else was farm tractors and everything else. But they started getting so many orders, they had to develop their own Shay manufacturing facility in Lima, Ohio. And it got bigger because these things were selling. This, as we said at the dedication, this is a little like Henry Ford's Model A. I mean, this all of a sudden opened up timber lands that were locked away because they were too inaccessible. People like George Weyerhaeuser, who had huge amounts in the Northwest, didn't know how he was ever going to log it until this came along. And so they had their own, this is Lima Locomotive Works, or Lima Locomotive and Machine Works, they had their own Shay drawing rooms, okay? And this continued throughout the entire life of that company. They had their own Shay division, and they sold, they sent out catalogs to lumbermen, etc., and they showed them all the attributes of this, and they sold extremely well for years and years and years. There were other competitors that came along trying to imitate certain things, and some of them were mildly successful, etc., but they all keyed off of Ephraim's brilliant idea of we need geared power. If we gear this thing, yeah, we're going to lose speed. We're not going to have it fast, but it's going to climb up the side of a mountain and climb down the side of a mountain. So, Lima would do great things for advertising. This one was going to an exposition, and they described the whole thing in silver lettering all over the tender to sell it. And they rarely came home with a locomotive. They usually sold them at the exposition to somebody who said, I want one of those, period. I'll take the floor model. That's it right there, okay? What's it going to take to put you in this Shay anyway? So here's one, whole advertising that went to the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904, just advertising the Shay patented geared locomotive. And it was that wild. And when you went to a World's Fair exposition, there was people in other parts of the country and the world that were coming, and they were starting to sell them now across the globe. There were Shays showing up in Taiwan, there were Shays showing up in Argentina, in Peru, etc., because they had the same problem. They couldn't get, most of the time, lumber. Sometimes it was other commodities. And Shays were also very popular in the mining industries where they had quarries, etc., with steep track, etc. And there was a lot of them that were used in other industries besides lumber. But lumber is where he really changed the face. And so he did a lot of different advertising, or they did a lot of different advertising over the years of these engines. And here's how to make more money with your logging engine. You need a Shay to make more money. And even when other rod type locomotive builders were starting to get some rod engines that were able to get some, part way into the woods, the Shay was still the one that was always the farthest into the woods. You might have a rod engine that left from the mill and went maybe to camp for speed because your track was better, but once it left camp and went up to the cutting area, that's where you needed your Shay locomotive, and that's where these things, you just, excel. And Shays for snow service. You can plow snow because they're not going to slip. Their drivers, with the gear drive, they're not going to spin like a tall drivered engine would. You've heard the old, I think I can, then spin, spin, spin. Shays don't do that, period. Now this is one of the interesting features of the Shay is the boiler is offset to the right, okay? It's offset to the right for a reason because the engine and the gearing is on the other side, on the left. And so you had to balance it, and the way to balance it weight-wise was the Shays were all built with that boiler offset. And people look at it, why are they looking at me funny? That's because the cylinders are over on the left side. And he even got a patent for that. And that's what this was. And so that's the easiest way to spot a Shay over any other locomotive that's got that offset boiler. Well, there was one gentleman that didn't like that, and that was Henry Ford. Okay? Henry Ford bought one of these for one of his plantations where he grew rubber. And Henry Ford, if you guys have been to the Henry Ford Museum, was a very eccentric person. He had to have all the bolts on his locomotive lined up the exact same way. He had OCD that just marvels anything, okay? He took one look at that and said, yeah, I need the Shay to get up into the woods for my rubber plant, but I don't like the looks of it. He figured out how to center the boiler with the engine on the left, and to this day, we don't know how he did that, okay? That engine went to Peru and Argentina, was never seen again, but it's always been a marvel. Here you are looking straight on at the Shay. The engine's still over on the left side, but it's centered and it's balanced. We still don't know how he did that, but that's the only Shay that you'll ever see that is not offset. That's just a Henry Ford nuance. Now, as Shay's got more improved, they got larger, and they went from the 2 trucks, which is each of these. Let me get my pointer here. Is this my pointer? I have a pointer. There we go. Okay, these are trucks. This is a 3-truck Shay. 1 truck, 2 truck, 3 truck. The Shay you have outside was the 2-truck version, a little smaller, okay? But this is also the engine that I run in Oregon. This thing was built in 1923, and it's got various improvements. It's got air brakes. Oops. Let me figure this pointer out. Yeah. It doesn't like me. I think my pointer died. Anyway, it's got an air brake system. The 3rd truck now, there's just water in that cistern on the back. That's a tender of just water. The oil is Beth here? Help me here, 'cause I'm pushing the pointer button. It gave me two red points, and that was it for it. Help me.
It doesn't like me either.
Do you want to point with an umbrella?
It's got low batteries.
Oh.
Give me 2 seconds. Keep talking.
Okay. Now, this is what's known as the fireman side of the locomotive. This is where, on steam locomotives, all locomotives, and even diesels, the engineer, as you're going forward, the engineer is on the right side of the engine. The fireman who runs the boiler and the water and the oil is on the left side. So this is the left side of a Shay. And so this is what a lot of rail fans call the boring side of the Shay. There's nothing going on here. And in fact, when I've been on Shays running them, et cetera, and you pull in and somebody just sees the fireman side come in and all this noise and smoke, and they're looking at it, what makes this thing go? I said, go around the other side. Go around the other side. Okay. But that's what the fireman side of a Shay looks like. But this is again a 3-truck Shay. Now it's got a heavy girder frame, which is a big improvement. This thing weighs about 90 tons. This is a good size one. So as the Shays evolved, they got more and more powerful. They started putting what's called superheated into them. So the boiler was a superheated boiler. It would superheat the steam. It would increase the power of the engine, and it would reduce the fuel and water consumption. And so that was a popular improvement. And other locomotives around the country, rod types, went to superheating as well. But Shay innovated and got those things superheated early. I see the red dot.
It works.
Okay.
So
What do you mean by super?
I know, that was what I was pushing, but it was dead.
Yep.
Okay, here we go. So anyway, back to my pointer. So here you got air brakes. This is an air pump on here. This is an air reservoir. This is for the brakes on the locomotive. You have air hoses, so you would connect those. And so Shay was constantly upgrading this design to make it more and more efficient for the larger lumber owners that would use railroads in there. Here, this is an oil burner, so the oil bunker is here, water is here, and this is boiler. But the innovative part is every ounce of weight of that locomotive, including the water and the fuel, is bearing down on a drive wheel. Every one of those wheels is connected, and so you have that greater adhesion to the rail, greater traction going up the grades, and that's what made Shay innovation that changed this whole industry. You can get Shays of all sizes. Here's a Shay built in the 1915 era, and it's a little 2-cylinder, 2-truck Shay. You can see from the man how small it is. He built them for sometimes contractors who were building dams and building jetties and all that would buy the smaller ones because they'd pick them up and move them around the country to other projects. But they had the same tracks that the loggers had, which were temporary tracks thrown down, picked up, thrown down again, and the Shay got through all that. Here's a little bigger one. It's got a early T boiler there. You know, this thing's about 1889. And then you got a little bit more sophisticated. Now the boiler is improved. It's still a 2-cylinder. So you can get 2 cylinders on the small ones, or 3 cylinders, and then the larger ones were all 3 cylinders. And here's what it looked like. Here's a Lima locomotive machine. Person setting this Shay up in California. This is a narrow gauge operation, but this is right out of the factory, and Shay representatives would come out with the engine, they would set it up, they would train the crews, and one of the things they had to train was the crews how to maintain it, how to keep it lubricated, etc. Because you've got a lot of moving parts here. That's one of the disadvantages of a Shay over a rod engines. You've got things to grease, you've got things to oil, and you have to keep up on it all the time, but that was a trade-off. Here's another Shay that Weyerhaeuser bought for their up in Washington. See, up in Weyerhaeuser's lands up in Washington, their timber was huge, and they had thousands of acres, and he was a huge volume lumberman, so he wanted to bring in billions of board feet every month, and it took railroad logging to do that kind of a production. Now here is a 4-truck Shay. This is in California. 1 truck, 2 truck, 3 truck, 4 truck. And the tender here is bigger for the water, and this is as big as they came was a 4-truck. But again, because of the design, there's not a wasted ounce of that locomotive that's not on top of a drive wheel. So this thing had massive traction. These had huge cylinders. This thing had 250 PSI on the boiler. It had an enormous amount of traction. So this lumber company, this was the Red River Lumber Company that was in Northern California. They still had steep grades that required a Shay, but they wanted to bring in huge volumes of timber, so they commissioned 2 of these engines. Now, when you're successful, like that from Shay's design was, and you're changed an entire industry, and you're selling these things like hotcakes, you're gonna get competitors and imitators, okay? And so in Oregon, in Portland, was the Willamette Iron and Steel Company. And Willamette Iron and Steel Company built boilers for ships, and they built boilers for loggers for their donkey engines and other loading engines and things like that. They built all sorts of logging, and then when Shays would tumble down a mountain in the Pacific Northwest, they would often go to Willamette Iron and Steel Works to get repaired. And so during this time, they're still selling them like hotcakes. Willamette started saying, there's money to be made here. What's the patent number on this? Oh, that patent's going to expire in 1922. So there were some of the Lima patents were expiring, and they went to Lima and they found one of the Shay engineering designers, hired him away, and then starting in 1922, Willamette Iron and Steel Company started building an imitation of the Shay called the Willamette Geared Locomotive. Now what it did was, by this point in time, we're in the early 20s, lumbering is big, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Loggers had certain needs that they wanted on a geared engine, on a Shay. And the way Lima worked was, okay, you want an enclosed all-weather cab? We'll make you that. You'll pay for it, that's an option. You want a girder frame that's stronger, will hold up longer? We'll do that. You'll pay for it, that's an option. You want cast steel trucks that are even stronger? We'll do that too, it's an option. So Willamette said, we know what the Northwest loggers want. We're gonna build exactly what they want right off the showroom floor, and they did. And it was very successful. They also, whereas on a Shay, there are 3 cylinders, 2 face forward, 1 faces back, and that's just for the valve motion, etc. That's the way all the Shays are. Oh, and also the last cylinder is partly inside the cab. That's the way they were designed. So if, heaven forbid, you need to take that cylinder off, the first thing you gotta do is take the cab off, and that's kind of a problem. So look at this. Okay, we got 3 cylinders. Now they're all of the valve faces are facing outward. And look, none of them are in the cab. So if you had to take one of the cylinders off next to the cab, you don't take the cab off. And so that's one way to tell a Willamette from a Shay, is that they have the outward facing cylinders. And so they did all of this at one cost. You don't have to order any options, and they starting to sell quite well. and they got the notice of Lima going, hey, we're starting to lose sales to this outfit in Portland, Oregon. So guess what? Lima came out with this. This is the Pacific Coast Shay. It was a model that came out in 1927 to compete directly with Willamette. Yeah, they still had the cylinders facing where they were, and they were only partly in the cab here, but they had the standard all-enclosed cab, standard girder frames, much stronger, standard cast trucks. You didn't have to pay extra, didn't have to pay options, so they came out directly to compete against Willamette's upstart imitation of theirs. And the year 1927 that this first Pacific Coast Shay was built, which is what this one was the last year that Willamette sold the locomotive. So Willamette got the last word on it, okay? But, you know, imitation is the greatest flattery, right? That's not the way Willamette took it, that's for sure. But anyway, this is the kind of work that in the Pacific Northwest and other places, a Shay could do. Here it's moving a 250-ton tower hoist. This is a steam tower hoist that they would set up and log a certain area in a 360 degree. It's got a couple of engines in the back, but it's doing the laboring chore going up this 6% grade here. And you can see in the Northwest, they're very thorough on their logging, okay? The old saying is there's no good tree other than the stump. But this is, you know, this is the kind of versatility that Shays could go, you know, this is a temporary trestle, even though it's a lot of work putting it up. They're only gonna be logging here for maybe a month, maybe 2 or 3 months. So this thing, they built it on the quick. But a Shay could go gingerly across, step lightly over this thing. It wouldn't be like a rod engine pounding it, and maybe pound it to a point that it would break. Shays were very easy on this, and that's why the loggers could get away with even trestles like this that weren't built as sturdy as a rod engine would be. And that was another innovation that Shay fostered. And here in the Northwest, we got a lot of wood. So you got logs, we can make logs into trestles if you want. Can you imagine what that would cost today and that kind of wood? But look at the size of the logs that this thing is pulling. And they keep going behind. There's probably another 10 cars of this, all being pulled by a relatively small, that's probably about a 40-ton, 2-truck Shay, just like you have outside here. But this is the kind of track that these engines could go on. You wouldn't want a rod engine on that kind of temporary track. And Shays could go anywhere. This Shay is actually under steam, being floated down a lake in Montana to a new site, and they just rolled it on there and under steam and took it down the lake to the next site. Now, Shays did every once in a while stub their toe, okay? And this is in California. This is a narrow gauge engine. You know, this top speed of a Shay generally in service would be about 12 to 14, maybe 15 miles an hour. Usually around 9 to 13 miles is where you would see them. So, like I said, they gave up speed for traction and versatility. But every once in a while, they would go off of the track. But generally, they were not going very fast. So generally, they would have this kind of problem. They could fix it easily, but not always, okay? This is in British Columbia, and sometimes they would actually roll down a mountain, okay? But I want to say that the construction of the Lima Shays were so well done, even this engine went back to service, okay? This thing wasn't cut up or anything. It was repaired and put back in service, okay? I can't say that for the crew. They might not have. Now here's a Shay that actually they found a broken stringer on a trestle in California, and you can see what happened. It crashed into the river. Here's one of the trucks. The cab is destroyed. Another truck has landed on its tender, and it has really flipped and cracked. This engine still runs today in the Sierras in California. This engine, this is Hobart Mills. They owned it until 1938, and just outside of Truckee. And then it went to the West Side Lumber Company, and they ran it until 1960. And then it went into tourist service out of the same town until the 80s, and then it was sold to Yosemite Mountain Sugar Pine Company just out of Yosemite, California. It still runs today. And that's how versatile and how durable they were, and and the loggers could fix these things. Okay, they didn't have to send it back to the factory. They would actually fix these things. And here's its sister engine. Got caught in a forest fire in camp. And it was in an engine house, and the engine house caught fire, and the engine caught fire, and because it was an oil burner, the oil in the bunker burst into flame. This is old bunker C, so it was incredibly hot. The frame has actually bent, and now the engine facility is sitting on the ground. It's just sagged from the heat. And of course, the cab's all warped, the tender's warped, the bunker's warped. This engine still runs today as well. It's in Colorado. It's been running ever since. This happened in about 1922, and it went to another lumber company. It ran it until 1960. Then it went into tourist service. It's been in Colorado, running across the Georgetown Loop. That's how durable these engines were, and the loggers could actually fix these things. I mean, look at the frame. You got to straighten that steel frame. That's not a wooden, that's a steel frame that just melted. But like I said, that engine still runs today. This is yours truly servicing a Shay. This is what, when you have a geared engine, especially a Shay, you have to do. We would run on a given weekend maybe 80 miles on ours, but every 10 miles we would stop to do an oiling and a servicing. And they've done that forever. This is in California. This is a narrow gauge engine. They're stopped for water. While the fireman is putting water into the tender, the engineer's out oiling. You got main bearing you got to oil. You got the crossheads on the cylinders you have to oil. You want to oil some of the line shaft bearings to keep them going. So you're doing that. Here it is, you know, before it leaves the mill. They're doing all this oiling and servicing. That took some time because you've got all these moving parts. But and the advantage of the Shay over some of its competitors, there was two other geared locomotive competitors that came along afterwards, and their drive mechanism was underneath the belly of the engine, right in the middle, okay? And they ran fairly well, etc. But they didn't sell nearly as many as Shays. For one reason is, here, everything that needs to be maintained is right there in front of you. That the crews can easily get out and do this more often, take better care, the engine will last longer, you don't need to get repaired. So this was one of the biggest innovations that Ephraim Shay did, is I want to make certain that the logging crews have easy access to keep this oil, keep it greased, make certain everything is where it is, and that was a distinct advantage that Shay had over any competitor that ever came along, because every crew could get to this thing easily. And it's just part of what a Shay needs. Now, the use of the Shay engines wasn't just for logging and mining and all that. There were a few railroads built in this country, and in other countries, but a few in this country, that were only built because of Ephraim Shay's accomplishment. This one is Mount Tamalpais out of Mill Valley, just north of San Francisco. This railroad was built purely as a tourist railroad to get people up to the top of the mountain, where they had a tavern, and you could overlook the San Francisco Bay, and you could see out to the Pacific. And it started in 1896, and it ran until the late 20s with just Shay engines, because they couldn't have done it without a Shay. But they took tens of thousands of tourists. There was no freight, there was nothing. It was just to go to the top of the mountain and have a view, okay? But only because Ephraim Shay's versatility. This was the Mount Tamalpais and Muir Woods Railroad, which was dubbed by the company itself the crookedest railroad in the world, because to get up there, they had to loop back and forth, loop back. They didn't do switchbacks, they just looped. Because of the versatility of the Shay, and it could take the tight corners and all that, and it could take the steep grades. I mean, here you're going up about a 7% grade, and you're still pulling cars front and back. So, I mean, that was if Ephraim hadn't done that engineering piece that you have out there on the park, that railroad wouldn't even exist. There was another one in Colorado that went up to the top of Argentine Peak that only was there for tourism, and it was only there because only a Shay could go up there. Now, here's one in South America, and is burning some either slab wood or some of these would actually, in areas that they did plantations, they would burn corn stalks and other things to use it. So these things you use anything for fuel, and that's why they became popular all over in South America, in Peru, in Taiwan. Taiwan still has about 4 operating Shay locomotives, and they've got another half a dozen or a dozen on display. Taiwan used a lot of those engines. This is a shot in Peru. Okay, it's a narrow gauge operation up in the mountains in Peru. It's because of this that Ephraim Shay isn't just somebody people in Harbor Springs know about. It's people around the world know about, because when you say Shay, everybody thinks of that locomotive. Now I put this in here because as popular as the Shay became, the Lima Locomotive and Machine Works started saying, well, okay, we're getting a good name for building a very good Shay locomotive. People like our construction, let's start building rod type engines to compete with the big Baldwin Locomotive Works, American Locomotive. Let's see if we can do that. So they got into building rod engines as well as the Shay. They always were running the Shay operation, but they started building mainline rod type engines, and they built them up to, this is a daylight locomotive right here, built to run between San Francisco and LA every day and in the late 30s. And this is the one we run out of Portland. But this now became the Lima Locomotive Works, and they became the #3 locomotive builder in this country. And back at the time, there was a lot of locomotive builders, kind of like a lot of car companies and all that. But because of Ephraim's invention and the success that Lima Machine Works had with the Lima Locomotive Machine Works, building Shays, they became a major player in building normal locomotives. This thing will go 100 miles an hour. Now, no, it's not going to go on the track that Shay's going to go on, but Lima became a big deal. It became the biggest employer in Lima, Ohio, all because of Ephraim's invention that they bought by giving him 10 shares of stock. So, I mean, I can't emphasize enough why when you say Ephraim Shay anywhere to somebody who knows anything about railroads anywhere in the world, they know what you're talking about. They know him, okay, because they know this invention. They may not know the waterworks, they may not know the AHA, they may not know of his hexagon house, but believe me, they know his name, and they know how he changed the industry. Here was an attempt by Lima to come up with a diesel, but still using the same gear design. They built a couple of them, they weren't wildly successful by the time the diesel era was coming along. The diesels didn't have the problem that the rod engines did, so, but they were always innovating, still using that original design. Here is the last operating Shay locomotive in logging service in the United States. This is in Klickitat, Washington, which is on the north of the Columbia River. This Shay stopped running April 3rd, 1964. Okay, and this is a Pacific Coast Shay. This was one of the ones they, to get, to compete with Willamette. But, so these things were still in logging service even into the early 60s, because they were that durable and versatile. What they finally couldn't compete with, the only thing they couldn't compete with, were by the time of World War II, when the trucks became much larger, much more powerful diesel motors and trucks, log trucks finally were able to actually bring in good-sized loads, and building a log truck road is cheaper than building a logging railroad. And that's the only thing that finally put the logging railroads, including the Shays, out of business, that they couldn't compete with now the new, more modern trucks that were not even a fantasy back when Ephraim Shay did his design back in the 1880s. And you'll see Shays in other places like beer ads, okay? That's a Shay. That's Heidelberg beer. So, and there's railroad recordings of these things. They're very popular by rail fans, of the ones that are still operating. In Cass, West Virginia, we talked about that. They have the largest number of operating Shays in the world. They've got 5 of them here, including the last one in line is the biggest one right here. That's the very last Shay that was built, and it was built, the whole thing's in 1945. That was the last Shay built. But if you think about it, diesels were already on the scene. They were taking over everywhere to build a Shay. Western Maryland Railroad back there wanted an engine for their coal hauling their into the hills for all of their mining operations. That was a 150-ton Shay. That was the largest ever built and the last one ever built. But if you want to go back to Cass, you can see a number of these things operating. Now here's those two. Here's one of the. This is the engine that fell off the trestle. There, that's it. That's running in California on a narrow gauge line. Built on an old logging company right of way. And here, this is the largest narrow gauge Shay ever built of the narrow gauge, which was the 3-foot gauge. And these engines still work today, every day. This is our Shay in Prineville. That's me making the smoke there. You do that for the photographers. Well, I kind of like making smoke, so I can't help it. This was done by a photographer from Seattle, came down one day and he had a camera that I'd never seen before. And this is, you don't run a Shay this fast, okay? This is an optical illusion, but I had to include it. So what he would do, and this was actually at our junction, and the background might have been some trucks and stuff you wouldn't want, whatever. What he would do is he would set up his camera and it would pivot at a certain speed, and his wife had a radar gun, and he would tell her what speed that he set the camera for. She would tell us, and she would use the radar gun to make sure we were maintaining the right speed. If we made the right speed, then it just kind of paid, and it blurred everything. But what it did, it turned the line shafts into kind of corkscrews. But we don't go that fast, okay? If we, like they say, you know, a Shay will do 10, maybe 15 miles an hour, a little faster off a cliff. We took our Shay in 1999 down to Rail Fair in Sacramento. I hitched a ride with the Daylight. That's one of those Lima Daylight locomotives, the Lima locomotive. We run out of Portland, so I ran my engine up on a flat car, and my buddies towed me down there, and we raced. Kate's here. Where's Kate? Okay, we raced Kate's husband's Shay from North Carolina. We had Shay races, which is a little like turtle races, okay? But people liked it, you know. So it was a lot of fun, but it exposed people to, at that point, 2 operating Shays. It was like 250,000 people at this event. There's Shays that you can see around the country on this, most of them that are surviving are on display. This one is up in Forks, Washington, and the display is improved over time. It's now got a roof on it, and it's enclosed to protect it from the weather, which, you know, I know that your plans are to try to do that on yours, but you will find a few Shays because they lasted until the end of the logging industry, the logging railroad industry, because they were so versatile. So by the time they lasted into the 60s, a lot of people didn't have the heart to cut them up, so they put them in the town parks. That's why a few of them. Here, a lumber company put this one on display in the late 50s. It's on a different display now, but it's in California, so they had a love affection. They just couldn't cut the thing up. Here's your engine in its operating days in Texas. This is the earliest shot I've ever found of your Shay. Yours is a 42-ton class, 2-truck Shay. It's a very simple design. It used to have a wood cab that probably either burned off in a fire or got crushed when a tree hit it, who knows. And so they fabricated the steel cab you see on it today. It has Lincoln pin couplers, not the automatic couplers. It has no air brakes on it. It just has, if you go on the fireman's side and you look below the frame, there's a pipe that connects to some rods. It's called a steam jam brake. And it's what the engineer could use as a brake, but it's all on or all off. They were just a backup plan for most locomotives. Most of them, you know, by the early teens, all had air brakes and air pumps and tanks, so you could regulate the brakes and all that. And you can send the braking down through the log cars. Well, this lumber company didn't have air brakes on their cars either, so they just had a brakeman that went from car to car, tying down the handbrake. So this is, you know, fairly crude. But so there's no air brakes, there's no air hoses, doesn't have a headlight here. There's no dynamo. A dynamo would be what you would use to pump steam in it to generate electricity, so you have lights for the headlight, the backup light, the cab lights. I'm not certain this thing ever had the headlight. Some loggers didn't log at night. They just logged during the daytime, and so I've never seen a picture of this engine that actually had a headlight on it. It might have, but this is your bare bones basic Hertz rent-a-car. That's my Shay. That's all I need. You know, how cheap can I make it? But it lasted, you know, all the way into you have. Now, the interesting thing is the engine was built in 1907, and the last operation of it that I can chronicle was in 1928. And after that, Carter closed down their logging railroad, and they moved all their locomotives. They only had one Shay. This one. They had a couple of riding. They moved them into the log yard in 1928, 29, and that's where they stayed. They stayed there until 1970. The family finally dispersed the locomotives, including your Shay went to Stephen Austin University in 1970. So that means this engine has either been parked in a log yard, on display at a university, or now with you for 94 years. Okay, it only operated for about 21 years, okay? So it actually is in pretty light, these things would operate often for 80 years, okay? This thing's got a lot of life in it. If you ever wanted to go fire it up, you could probably do it. Hint, hint. Anyway, here's what it looked like on this display when I first called him about the engine. I could tell it hadn't seen a lot of love in a while, was under these trees. Looked like it needed a home, is what I thought. And and if, for those of you who were there at the talk today, that's the infamous plaque, okay? That's the plaque that they'll find an appropriate place for wherever the heck that will be. I want to find a plaque one day. Yeah, so anyway, this is them moving it. This is Tom Moran's crew, moving it out of there. And
In Texas.
out of Texas, and this is at his machine shop after it landed. So you can see there's been a fair amount of work on it to get it cleaned up, and there's a lot of work on it. But these engines, like you can tell, you can repair these things all day long. They're well built in the first place, and so this is more cosmetic. And of course, this is what it looks like here with you. There's a few more little things to do with it, but it's mostly there. And it's just a shameless plug. This is the book we did about 4 years ago. In fact, I was editing this book when I was contacted to go find you guys at Shay. And this is the most recent book on Shay. There was one done by Michael Koch back in 1972 on the Shay, a very good book. But we decided it needed a whole new book. There's a lot of new material and a lot of new photos and diagrams and things. So we did a new book, and this thing is available on, this is our third printing. We did 3 printings in about a year and a half. And this publisher, who I worked with before, actually they published my other book, Timber Titans. This outfit has been doing railroad books for years and years and years. And the publisher finally confided in these, most of them, and usually they're diesel books, they're mainline locomotives, not logging. And this is the first logging books these two had ever done. And he said, I've never had to reprint a book before, and I've had to reprint both of yours now. He said, so now I'm actually working with 2 of my co-authors. We're doing a new book on the Willamette, the one that was the copy of the Shay, and we're doing a brand new book on that. So we'll see how that sells. But anyway, that's what it's like being in the cab running the Shay. That's being in my other office, so to speak. And this is the Shay patent plate there that was on a lot of Shays. I don't think it went back in 1907, I'll have to look. But Shay was very proud of that patent, and he put patent plates all over his engines to make, because he knew he didn't want to lose the patent. When they expired and Willamette took it, he got even more, or they got even more earnest about protecting it. But the reason he was so protective of this patent and all was because his innovation of a geared versus direct dive, his innovation of every ounce of weight, including fuel and water, on the drive wheels, and the versatility of these trucks changed everything. And that all of a sudden, people who had timber holdings could now access it and make millions, and they did, and they used it. I have a video, if you can help me here. There's a short video taken at Cass, but it well shows the workings of a Shay as it works. And you'll see the gearing, the bevel gears, the line shafts, the universals, and the way the wheels pivot. You can then get a real clue how these things were just, mountain climbing monsters.
Hold on. It's not showing. I have to mirror my screen. Sorry. Oh, goodness.
Oh, wow.
Okay, you see that crankshaft going here? There's a crankshaft right there, just like on your car, except one heck of a lot bigger. Yeah, it's going backwards. See, there's the bevel gears, there's the slip joints, the universals. Here's your crankshaft, got 3 cylinders. That slip joint will go in and out to allow the trucks to pivot left and right. Yeah, they're on each of the wheels. There is the slip joint right there. Goes in and out, so as the truck turns one way, it slows out. As it turns the other direction, it'll go in, but it stays connected. So at all times, all wheels are turning at the exact same torque, the exact same pressure, the exact same RPM. Everything is turning in unison.
Are the left wheels connected to the right wheels somehow?
Yeah.
On the left side of the engine?
Well, they're connected with an axle,
Yeah,
but the all four wheels of each truck, or every wheel is being powered. Maybe just through the axle, but yes, absolutely. So you've got all that weight on all those trucks bearing down and giving you that kind of traction. And so you can take very tight curves. You can almost take corners with this thing, whereas the rod engines take sweeping, gentle curves, otherwise they will jump the track.
At what point do you go from narrow gauge to mainline gauge? Just the size of the vehicle, or?
No, it depends on what you want to build. The reason you did narrow gauge is that the engines were smaller, the cars were smaller, you gave up something on that, but it was easier that you built, your right of way could be less wide. So if you're going like the Colorado mountains, there was a lot of narrow gauge railroads built in the Colorado mountains because they had to blast out everything out of the rock. If you can make the width of the track less, you'll do less blasting.
So the Silverton and Durango is a Shay user?
No, it's narrow gauge, but it didn't use Shay.
Oh,
But it's narrow gauge. But this is at Cass putting on one of their rail fan weekends. But this gives you an idea of what a moving, operating, breathing Shay looks like and how it could, you can just see how it could crawl anywhere, okay, and it did.
Bucket list, wanna go.
Yeah.
And the sound of that isn't like anything.
Right, yeah,
Very loud.
Is there volume on this?
No, it's
No.
not coming through.
yeah.
Sorry, it was loud.
When these things are coming towards you, when you don't see them, a lot of people, when they were first beginning to take pictures of Shays out in the woods in the 40s and 50s, the rail fans would say, like, this thing sounds like it's coming 60 miles an hour towards me, and then it just crept around the corner and it was going at 8 miles, because you got the 3 cylinders rapidly moving those gears, and so the rapid exhaust sounds like it's just coming at lightning speed, but it's not. It kind of fools you in that way. Okay, that'll do.
Mark, how many Shays were built over Sloyd?
2,767
Wow.
total, by line, okay, through his path, exactly. So, yeah, I'm ready to take answers or questions and give you answers, and make something up.
Big
if you
round of
want.
applause.
I just want you to understand why I'm from Shay's world, because he did change the entire lumber industry. I mean, that's not a small statement. So it's kind of like Henry Ford changing what he did for transportation. This opened up the timber of this country to be logged finally in a capacity that this country needed at the time. Thank you. Yes,
So he did this because he had timber.
correct.
Was he an engineer, and how did he come up with that design?
Well, he was certainly a very bright person. He had done a few other inventions. He was a tinkerer, he was a machinist. And so he came up with this from his ingenuity. He didn't, his formal training wasn't extensive in this area. He wasn't trained in this right, but he was somebody who could design it like his boat. He decided, I'm gonna build my boat the way I want it. And this was something he said, I need to get into my timber, and I can't afford anything else horses and logging, so he did it on his own. Yeah.
Would Lima custom make different gauges for their
Yes.
customers?
Yeah, they went as far down on Shays as 2-foot gauge,
Yeah.
and then there were some on really old railroads that had broad gauges, because the old railroads, some of the really old ones, inherited their gauge from when they had 2 oxen towing their cars, and whatever the width of the two oxens were, that was their gauge. And so they would build broad gauge ones as well. Most of them were standard gauge or narrow gauge, which would be 3 foot general, but sometimes it went down to 2. So they would build for all over. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on, I noticed one of the slides that said sales office, New York City. Seems like their marketing must have been pretty sophisticated.
Yes, they had sales offices in San Francisco and Seattle, they had them in New York, they had one in West Virginia for a period of time. They had regional sales office of salesmen that would go out and visit lumber camps and mills and sell, and then also help maintain the parts supply for repairing parts. And so these sales offices not only sold the locomotives, but they would also take them back in on trade and then resell them to somebody else. And they would also go out and monitor how these engines were holding up. And they'd also go out and say, oh, I went and I visited this mill and this camp, and they're about to expand into this new cutting area. And they would say, I think you need a new Shay. And they go, yeah, I guess I do, don't I? Well, I'm the guy for you. So that's why they had them in the regions where they were selling. And San Francisco was one because there was a lot of loggers up in the Sierra that they could visit and sell it to. Yeah.
Quick question. I mean, they get small tonnage to the big monster ones. Typically, how much would those things cost back in those days? A lot.
Yeah, well, a lot at the time. I mean, again, you're gonna have to convert
Right.
the numbers. A small Shay you could get for, 25,000. One of the bigger ones would go up to 40 and 50. The really big ones might be 60,000 in those dollars though, okay?
Back in those days.
Yeah, back in those, it was not a small investment. It was a very big investment. So you had to be you had to be able to log and mill enough wood to pay for that kind of capital investment. That was the difference between railroad logging and the small chippo logging. But the volumes, they paid for themselves.
Did they have any problems with not having the ties on the tracks in the woods?
You say not having the ties?
Well, you said they had just single rails.
Well, that one picture, that outfit didn't use ties.
Oh, so that was unusual.
That was unusual, and there were all kinds of variations where guys were trying to cut money costs and build a rail on anything, period. It was kind of like the one that went through the creek. They didn't want to build a bridge, okay? So, yeah, they had to be able to be flexible on that, and they worked well. Sure.
Did Shay actually work in Harbor Springs?
Well, he worked for himself here. I mean, he had his Hemlock Central, he had his machine shop, et cetera.
He spent much of his time here.
Well, yeah, he lived here, yeah, in his later, not in his really early years, but in his most later years, yeah. Sir? Yeah, Kate? She's a plant, so don't worry about it.
But I have an honest question.
Oh, well, okay.
About how many Shays are left, say, on display, cold? But about how many do you know to actually be operating?
Well, the operating ones change yearly as they come in and out of operation. There's 115 that we know of just in existence, period. And it varies between 25 and 35 in the world that actually operate. And that varies sometimes by 10 over a couple, there's a lot of work in maintaining these engines, especially as they get to be over 100 years old, which most all of them are over 100 years old now. And it just depends on how they were maintained and how often they were used. But there are some engines that have been continuous operation. Those two that I showed you, one was burnt up and one fell off the trestle. That was in continuous operation for well over 100 years. The one that fell off the trestle was 1950, and it was built, and it's still running today.
I had to share this picture because this is Harbor Springs.
There you
For those
go.
who don't know, this is one of Shay's home-built locomotives. I think this is Baby, but it's hard to see from here. He called it Baby after his granddaughter Dorothy. And then this picture is also Harbor Springs. This is East Hill, right where that culvert is, and this is even Shay in the cab. So this was one of his other home-built locomotives. So,
But you can still see the same design
yep,
is
exactly
there,
the same.
absolutely, even in the earliest of them.
Yeah, when you showed this picture, I was like, it's us.
There you go. Anything else, anybody? Sir?
The whistles, I know the different locomotives had a 3-chime or 5-chime or something. Did they have a whistle that was consistent with the Shay, the old ones they made?
When you bought a locomotive, steam locomotive, Shay or any other kind, you could specify, if you wanted to, what type of whistle came on it, or you could just, hey, say, don't give me a whistle, I got my own. And so there was something that was, some railroads used, were called Nathan whistles, some of them used Hancock whistles, some were 5 chimes, some were 6 chimes, some were just Hooter whistles, which is 1 chime. You could get whatever you wanted, on a Shay or anything else. That was something that was tailored to the operation. Because some of them use different types of whistles, like Southern Pacific used 5 chimes on almost all their engines, and other railroads just use 3 chimes. And the different number of chimes changes the entire tone and sound of a whistle, and certain railroads wanted it, and like the Norfolk and Western, they had these Hooter whistles, big, huge locomotives, and these really deep Hooter whistles. That was something that they were famous for, and that's what they ordered. So you just tailored it to whatever the operator wanted. Yeah.
How do we get a hand, your book?
Well, I was hoping you guys to be selling them here.
We do, we
Do?
still have, I think, 2 downstairs in the museum store, and we're ordering more.
Okay.
So if you don't get one today, they will be back in our store as soon as I can get them from the publisher.
Yeah, they're available at the publisher. I don't want to say Amazon, but I want you to buy hers. But they're still, they're running out of the 3rd printing. I don't know if we're going to do a 4th printing or not, but it was well received. We were real pleased. We covered all the engines. It's all new material from the first book. So, and that just tells you how important. When you look at the book, and it's, I don't know, 400 pages long, whatever it is, with all these photos worldwide, you can say, well, no wonder everybody knows who Ephraim Shay is. My God, they're everywhere, you know. So it was a labor of love. So, anything else? Well, I appreciate you guys coming very much.